This is April's Ballotpedia's Insights. So it's kind of a different world we're living in than our last one, but we're back. I'm Sarah. I'm Ballotpedia's Director of Strategic Partnerships. And for 2020, as you know from our previous guests this year, we're focusing on the prominent figures who are engaging in the discussions around the divisions of our country. Elections are still happening this year. We're still going through the primary season when these pushback dates start coming up again, early summer. So we're focusing heavily on the 206 pivot counties, the ones that voted for Obama in 2008, Obama in 2012, and then Trump in 2016, hence the pivot. So I'm really excited because of that to have JD Durkin. He is the DC Chief Correspondent for the business news network Cheddar. He is the host and co-host of the Cheddar series on the 206 pivot counties, which is, of course, a topic that is near and dear to the hearts of Ballotpedia staffers. So they've been going pre-quarantine. They've started traveling to the 206 counties that are made up of the pivots. So again, if you're watching on Zoom or on Facebook Live, please let me know as we go along if you have any questions. But before we get started, as always, here's my disclaimer. At Ballotpedia, we take our neutrality extremely seriously, and sometimes we have guests and prominent figures on who do take a slant on things. So if you're going along, please feel free to recommend anybody who you think would be a good guest or contributor to Ballotpedia Insights, because we're always looking for a wide variety of backgrounds, of opinions, of just any kind of information that a reader might be interested in. So let's get started. Thanks for joining us, JD.
Of course, thanks for having me. Really good to be with you.
Yeah, so as a background to this call, I was just scrolling through JD's Twitter before we joined today, and I saw he posted 2 days ago that you are indeed COVID positive. So this is incredible that he's here and looks as good as he does joining us from DC.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It's been a tough last week, but actually the last few days I've been feeling pretty good. I was just back on the air for the first time early this morning over on Cheddar Business, but definitely took the better part of a week off my feet, and I certainly needed it. So if you, by the way, I have to say this at this point, if you think you've been exposed or you have symptoms, please do not play around. Get yourself a test. It's not a pleasant experience by any means, but I think it's really important that everyone goes through it if you feel like you need to. So definitely feel like I need to throw that out there after the week and a half or so that I've had.
Yeah, always a good reminder. And, you know, it sometimes feels kind of distant as we get through the weeks and weeks and weeks of this, but people are still getting diagnosed and it's still very serious. So let's start first. Before the pandemic hit, before we're at where we're at, where had you been able to get to? Can you just tell me a little bit about the genesis of this project and what it's looked like from your end?
Yeah, of course. Well, again, thanks for being willing to have this conversation. I mean, the genesis of the project was that it's just such a cool part, I think, of the electoral map for 2020, right? I mean, there's so much of a conversation about this idea of an Obama-Trump voter and what that type of voter, is geared towards with regards to the spirit of the Democratic Party. You know, are you more in the progressive lane or the so-called moderate lane? And then I think more importantly, what are the sort of trends? What are the best thinking, the best thought that voter might do for 2020? Is that voter going to stay with Donald Trump, or of course, in this case now seems as if this might go with Joe Biden? So the show is, I think it's really unlike anything out there in politics. We really try and do community profiles, and we're telling the personal stories of the voters, of the communities, the constituents, much more so than you get for a typical political panel show. You know, there's a bit of debate and cable news talking heads. We didn't want that. We wanted much more of like a without reservations, deep in the field, deep in the community sort of feel. So our production usually takes, about 5 days or so. Our first episode was Jasper County, Iowa, which is just outside of Des Moines, a big agricultural community. Our second episode then went to Valencia County, New Mexico, which is a pretty far off the grid community that for whatever reason has correctly chosen every winning presidential candidate since 1952. It's like the bellwetherest of bellwethers for whatever reason. So we did a cool piece there. Our third episode was about Blue Earth County, Minnesota, which is about 2 hours south of the Twin Cities. And then right before the coronavirus pandemic really struck and started impacting things, we went down to Monroe County, Florida, which is pretty much all of the Florida Keys and the Florida Everglades.
That's great. So I came to hear of this project through a state legislator who's in the Minnesota county. He had posted it on his Facebook. And I'll just say this, they were so excited to hear about somebody coming out and focusing on what makes their communities unique, what kind of is driving the reason why they're pivoting. So it was just really fascinating to see the state legislator in this kind of political climate, really happy to have the media there. Have they been receptive to you guys coming in and doing these profiles?
Yeah, very much. Because look, I think there's so much of the newsroom chatter and conversation that just gets written about or talked about in cable newsrooms in Washington, D.C. and New York, right? I mean, we're guilty of being called the Acela corridor crowd. Like the blue check marks of Twitter are pretty much entirely composed of these two cities just 300 miles away. And I think this show gave us an opportunity to book the plane tickets and really get out there in the community. And every single state that we've gone to, every pivot county has been so welcoming because they want the opportunity. And no matter who we've gone to, whether they're deep red conservatives or they're on the progressive scale, as long as you're willing to go with good faith and quite literally hat in hand and explain that you're a journalist from DC, but you're here to tell their story, you're here to listen. People have been so incredibly welcoming and gracious. And so we've seen that with community leaders and activists and community protesters. And we've seen that with elected officials at the state legislatures and in all the places that we've gotten to go to. If you're there willing to listen and willing to tell their story, people have definitely been inclined to open up their doors.
That's really interesting. It feels counter narrative to what we've been hearing in the past couple of years. So that's fascinating. So the counties that you mentioned, they feel very different just when you're going through the lists. They're pretty spread out. What are the, I guess, like top line things that you're seeing as the common thread through these pivots?
I think with regards to common thread, I hear from a lot of these voters that when they try and go back and they look at the postmortem of 2016, a lot of them have said, look, maybe Donald Trump wasn't the perfect fit, but he was an outsider sort of candidate. He spoke about things in a fundamentally different way. And one thing that I've heard in most of the pivot counties, if not all of them that I've been to, is this idea that by the time of the 2016 election, Americans have known the Clinton name for so many decades. There's been such an opportunity for a strong counter narrative and just for negative sentiment to build up about the work of our former Secretary of State. Sure, Democrats have long argued that Hillary Clinton was the person best suited to do the job, perhaps out of any other candidate ever. But so many voters we've spoken to in small town America in these communities say, look, we knew so many bad things about the Clinton name, we wanted to try something else. So that was sort of an interesting trend that we keep seeing over and over again. The other thing, interestingly, I think that we were not expecting that has just really kind of like blown me away with our reporting was the Gary Johnson impact and the fact of third-party candidacies in 2016. It was really strong, of course, when we went to New Mexico, where Gary Johnson had been a former governor, and he earned about 9% of the state vote, which is huge. But he's also really appealing to parts of Blue Earth County, Minnesota. We had farmers in Iowa tell us that they really liked Gary Johnson. In the Florida Keys, which is a very sort of libertarian, live and let live feel, right? People who like to be off the grid, envision limited government interference. When they walked into the ballot booth, they realized they sort of had this other, more palatable option. And I think in a lot of communities, Gary Johnson kind of played spoiler. I hear a lot more interest for Gary Johnson than I did of Jill Stein. And I think it's going to kind of be interesting to watch, what do we have out of a Justin Amash, or do we have a third-party candidacy for 2020? Because the Gary Johnson impact was way larger in 2016 in a lot of these places than I otherwise thought that he would have.
Those people who did end up casting a Johnson vote, do you think they pulled more from Trump or Hillary?
Great question. I can explicitly think of one farmer that we recently spoke with in Blue Earth County, Minnesota, had been a longtime Republican voter, and specifically said, I do not want to vote for Donald Trump. There were a lot of controversial comments that this person felt that candidate Trump had made. But the thing that I've also heard from a number of Gary Johnson voters we spoke with is that they really regret voting for Gary Johnson. And on more than one occasion, we've already spoken with pivot community voters who have said, I will definitely be voting for a Democrat. The other challenge to the series time-wise, Sarah, is that we started doing it at a point when we had well over a dozen Democrats still running. Yeah. And by the time we're doing the series now, we're down to a presumptive nominee. And of course, COVID-19 concerns are changing the whole conversation. So even the trajectory of the time of when we've kind of done the county profiles, when we've done the show, has changed so rapidly. But it's kind of interesting to look at a lot of those recurring trends county to county.
Well, and especially, you know, if we think about the idea that the Clintons have been establishment for so long, and people were voting against the name and voting against that establishment feeling, does Biden conjure up the same sort of establishment feeling? I'll be really curious to see that too. I know, you know, he doesn't have some of the name baggage that a Clinton does, but it's still kind of that idea of decades in the government. It's still very contrasted to Donald Trump.
It's definitely a rank and file DC insider name. There's no doubt about it. Interestingly, I think in the early months of our show, you know, someone like Mayor Pete Buttigieg had a lot of enthusiasm out there because he was, I think, someone sort of seen as being a bit more of that centrist lane, maybe could pull over some of those uncertain conservative voters, but was offering something at the same time a bit new. There was a ton of interest in these communities. Of course, we did do an entire episode in Minnesota, but for Senator Amy Klobuchar, really popular. We heard a lot of enthusiasm for her in other states that weren't just Blue Earth County, Minnesota. And for a long time, even Michael Bloomberg. I had a Pivot County voter, someone who voted quite literally twice for Obama, that then voted for Trump, tell me, this was in Belen, New Mexico, which is in Valencia County, tell me explicitly, I am not voting for Trump, but there's really something about Michael Bloomberg that I really like. Now we know what happened with the Bloomberg campaign, but it does kind of show you, I think there has been an appetite for a lot of these voters for something a bit different.
So, okay, so for those voters that you were able to talk to who were Obama Trumps, what is their feeling over the past 4 years? Are they interested in doing another pivot? Are they comfortable with Trump? How has the appeal of Trump then changed over the last 4 years since they first casted their vote for him?
I'd say it's about 50-50. There's definitely a lot of diehard Trump supporters, and I think they are very enthused, specifically a lot of members of the agricultural community. They really cite the fact that this president took the fight to China. And they say that this is a president who is willing to represent American interests first, and that's not something we've had in our community. Also, a place like Jasper County, Iowa has a heavy veterans community. Mm-hmm. And that has almost impenetrable, Donald Trump support that we've noticed from veterans of a lot of different ages, which is sort of a bit of an interesting development there. But I think for other voters, I definitely got the sense for some Obama Trump voters that they're looking to go back to a Democrat, even if they weren't at the time, because of when we were there, sure who the Democratic nominee is. We've tried to do our due diligence to stay in touch, especially during the threat of the coronavirus, see how these voters and communities are being impacted. And it does seem to me as if they say, hey, Joe Biden may not be perfect, but we are going to plug our nose and vote for the presumptive nominee of the Democratic Party, even if we did not do so in 2016.
Now, are there some Trump supporters, pivot voters who have doubled down on their support of Trump? I mean, before the pandemic, we were in a really strong economy. Yeah. Things seem to kind of be progressing well. I'd imagine a few are still pretty staunch Trump supporters.
Yeah, I for sure, I think so. But you're exactly right. A lot of these conversations were before the virus outbreak. And I would actually argue we've probably started to see a lot of Donald Trump's wall get cracked a little bit with regards to the last 5 to 6 weeks of this handling. And one thing we're only starting to do now is kind of re-pick up a lot of those conversations. But I've spoken with a lot of people who've been very, very frustrated with what they've seen out of Donald Trump. And they think that there's a little bit of this, one voter described it to me as like a snake oil salesman who's just sort of up there right now in this era, trying to peddle anything to encourage enthusiasm when that's not really the sense of volatility that people need right now. They need that steady hand. And I think there is a sense that a lot of people are saying, hey, say what you will about so-called sleepy Joe Biden, but this is as steady a reliable hand as you know you're going to get, basically, Nash. Like, you know exactly what you're going to get. It may not be flashy, but the American people don't need flashy right now. And so I think for the first time, Donald Trump is really being challenged, Sarah, with something that he could not even foresee happening. And clearly the conversation, especially on the economy, looks so drastically different than it did 6 weeks ago.
Yeah, and it's created an environment where there isn't much public outright campaigning happening, which I think is going to be a very interesting factor in the cycle. You know, we're seeing a little bit of the punching up and punching down between the two, just on Twitter and their phone call and everything like that. But we're not what is a debate going to look like this cycle? Are we going to have in-person debates? What are the conventions going to look like? How do I wonder how the general population in a pivot county is going to feel when they're not seeing, if it gets to the point where they're not seeing the two candidates interacting together on a debate stage, how this kind of campaign cycle is going to affect those pivot counties particularly. In your communication with them, are they excited to vote this cycle? I'm really curious what the pulse is about, are we going to see a low turnout again in 2016 or in 2020, similar to what we saw in 2016? Or is this pandemic almost going to increase people wanting to get out and vote? What do you think?
I mean, I think before the virus outbreak, the answer was definitely there was a ton of enthusiasm. I don't think there was any reason to doubt kind of pollsters that predicted 2020's numbers would be higher than they had been, because especially if you look at 2018's midterms, right, there's this real enthusiastic sense, especially in a lot of our suburban communities, to get out there. But you got to think here, Sarah, I think this election is going to look so dramatically different. I mean, just the sheer volume of mail-in and absentee ballots is really going to skew these numbers to historic proportion. And I know that there's the sort of kind of go-to response is to say, well, it's going to benefit Democrats. The DNC has been far better, say a lot of people, about trying to encourage and push for mail-in voting. You listen to how Democrats on Capitol Hill speak about that issue with a lot higher ease than their Republican counterparts, and Republicans reportedly are sort of scrambling. And that comes from the top. It comes from a Republican president who has said there's nothing good can be done from the increase of mail-in voting, right? There's reason to be suspicious about these numbers and so on and so forth. But the fact is, we're going to have millions and millions of more absentee and mail-in ballots than we've ever had. I don't think it's even clear how well the states can even handle the sudden surge in mail-in ballots. And I think there's a good argument to say we may not even know on election night who the winner of this election is, because so many of the surrounding underlying fundamentals of how this election is going to work is still kind of being decided. And I think all those things are going to have a huge impact on who ends up coming out on top.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we're seeing some of the public opinion start changing on when the opening updates are happening, what it is going to look like to reopen society. And I think this is going to be one of the most critical issues in a presidential election we've seen in the last 100 years. And it could shift dramatically how people are thinking about both the candidates. Do you think that, you mentioned mail-in ballots, do you think that some of these election policy changes, so specifically, also I saw a meme yesterday to never apologize for your animal showing up on your Zoom during this time. So you'll see my cat.
I'm so happy you called attention to it, because I sat there during my response and said, no, JD, just continue on. It's totally normal. I hope your cat is enjoying quarantine as much as you are.
Well, he's not a fan of social distancing, so he hears another voice that's not mine and really wants to come say hi to everybody. So sorry about that. Anyway, so yeah, in these pivot counties, all of these election reform policies, at Ballotpedia, we're partners with everybody kind of in the civic space, and we're hearing a lot about changes, permanent changes potentially to mail-in ballots, voting at home, what that type of reform looks like. I'd imagine it's probably split down the middle of people who are suspicious of moving towards that system versus people who are very welcoming. Have you heard anything in these pivot counties about praise of these changes or concern about them?
Concern for sure. There were some more elderly voters in Monroe County, Florida that I've gotten to catch up with over email the last couple of weeks. And they're concerned, especially if you're an older voter and you're so used to voting one way, that's your reliable way to make sure your vote has gotten counted in every midterm or every local election. And now that process is being disrupted. And I think you have a lot of people out there who are probably just looking at the traditional so-called snail mail system, and they're saying, I barely send things through the mail. It's one thing to get my census form in the mail, but it's another thing where we are increasingly resulting in the e-communication space. And I think a lot of uncertainty, right? Everyone's got a story of something really important being lost in the mail. We all literally do. Some package hasn't shown up. And I think people's voice starts going there, and they say, well, what if my vote, what if the promise of what I get to do to take part in our democratic republic and our democratic system gets lost in the mail. And so I have heard a lot of concern about what that's going to do. But at the same time, look, Sarah, people know, and I think that a lot of Democrats I've spoken to are looking at these Wisconsin primary and saying, we now know that people have gotten sick because of that day's exposure. And that's a very serious thing. And there's a possibility too that we have another big wave of the coronavirus around the time of the election, right? If this is going to be seasonal, we've heard from the Dr. Fauci's and the Dr. Deborah Birx's of the world to say the fall flu season may be, pretty rough as well with regards to this in September, October, November. Does that further encourage people to stay home and to try and avoid public polling places? All those things are going to be throwing off these numbers, I think.
Mm-hmm. I'm still waiting for my cat mask from Amazon that was supposed to get there a week ago. So, but yeah, and I would imagine that the concern about the mail-in ballots, if there is growing suspicion, that would probably fuel more of a Trump base who likes the traditional voting methods. That'll just be really interesting because I think this is going to change voting in America for a long time. So it really will be interesting to track then how the pivot county voters feel about going all mail-in. Wisconsin was such a big deal. Ballotpedia is based out of Wisconsin, so we always love following those elections and seeing the lines around Milwaukee because they only had 5 polling places open. Yeah, it's just, we don't know what's going to happen there.
And the conventions, you brought the conventions too, if I may, that's a really good point, right? I mean, this idea of a virtual convention, I've attended these conventions back in 2016 in Cleveland and Philadelphia. And for people who don't know, these are massive hockey and basketball arenas. Take whatever your local NHL or NBA franchise is that fits tens of thousands of people. And it's pretty much that packed to watch Barack Obama speak. And with regards to the uncertain future of concerts and sports games and music venues, with regards to how the kind of the space between people, I have no idea how they're going to do these conventions and how they pack these halls with thousands of delegates, but those challenges are really going to be on for both the RNC and DNC, and I think it's going to be a big story in the months and weeks ahead of the election. Yeah,
and they're talking about paring down what the DNC will look like. That's also going to be in Milwaukee. And you even think about the economic ramifications. I was in Cleveland and Philly too, and the entire city basically shut down for these conventions. A whole division of the tourism for the year was dedicated to conventions. So even just thinking about the economic ramifications of a small convention is it's astounding what this has done in terms of both politics and economics. But so running mates. So, we're presuming that Pence remains Trump's running mate in 2020. Joe Biden has announced that he'll be picking one soon, and he's promised to pick a female. Do you think this is going to help him in pivot counties? Is it going to be a draw that he's announced publicly that it will likely be a female vice president? And then do you think any of the ones that have been touted as potential vice presidential nominees are particularly appealing to pivot county voters?
Yeah, well, for a long time when we visited a lot of these places, there were two key names that I would argue are sort of reached the Venn diagram with two names we heard from pivot county voters that are also on Biden's reported short list, and they're two former candidates. And it's Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren, I would say number 2, but really number 1 for a lot of these places, without a doubt, Minnesota Senator Amy Klobuchar. Again, not just because of Blue Earth County, where she has a ton of support. She's a proud member. There the Democratic Party's called something a little different. It's called DFL, Democratic Farm and Labor. So if you're a Democrat who represents Minnesota, you're almost not really like a regular national Democrat. You have your own interstate identity. And that's so important to Minnesotans. So there's something to say, even voters with a long history who vote red will still always sort of give consideration to a Democrat because you kind of represent the ag interest really well. So, but again, not just in Minnesota though, in other places we went to as well, including Jasper County, Iowa, there's a ton of interest for Senator Klobuchar. And so I think those would be 2 names to continue to watch. I know a lot of the debate for the Biden campaign right now, they say, okay, well, with what demographics does Joe already sort of shore up the vote, versus does he need to go in a different direction? With regards to a lot of Black voter support in this country or progressive voter support in this country. and it's a really difficult choice, but those have been the kind of the names that repeatedly jumped out to me. I know there was more than a few disappointed pivot voters who were a little bummed to see Senator Klobuchar not do as well as she did during the primary.
Yeah, that would have been the most interesting angle, because it would have had such a wide appeal to the Rust Belt and to the states like Wisconsin and Michigan that did pivot too as full states. I'm really, so setting aside presidential, thinking about down ballot, what does this look like? So we track very closely state legislative races and the waves that Republicans had for many cycles of really picking up Republican houses in the state and senates in the state and creating these big Republican trifecta governments in the state. If we do see more of a pivot back to blue in 2020, like we saw in 2018, we saw that little ripple of state legislative elections in 2018 go to Democrats. Will we see that continue? Do you sense that these voters are going to care about down ballot again, or what are they saying about their local politicians rather than just the faraway presidential?
Yeah, I've been so impressed, Sarah, because so many of these communities we've gone to, the people intimately know who's at the state legislature, and it largely has to do with who shows up. We spoke with a member of the local community legislature during a diversity roundtable in the community of Mankato, Minnesota. And here we were with all these elected, or with all these kind of community leaders and small business owners, and the state rep who represents that district showed up into the coffee shop to join our conversation for our episode. We also sat down with someone in New Mexico who's also in the state house, a state rep Republican named Alonzo Baldonado. And Alonzo, who's again a Republican, a pretty pro-Trump New Mexico Republican, I'd say. He's been open to distance himself from Donald Trump where he feels like he needs to, but for the most part he's on the committee to help reelect Donald Trump locally. And he brings up an outstanding point about New Mexico voters, which is there's a lot less of an emphasis in a lot of deeply purple areas with regards to what party you are. What matters more is that you're willing to show up. And so there's a really interesting trend in New Mexico politics where voters will walk into the ballot booth and they will, into the ballot box, they will vote for Donald Trump, a Republican. For Congress, they'll vote for the Deb Haalands and the Democrats of the world. And then they'll go to the state house and they'll vote Republicans again, because it's all about who showed up. Well, if Donald Trump bothered to do a rally nearby the community, that's going to mean a lot. But if it's the Democrats challenging for Congress who have made the effort to visit Belen or Los Lunas, that's going to mean a lot. And so they'll go back and forth on one ballot, which is an incredible voting pattern that I think more Americans do than people kind of give credit for. And I think it largely has to do with who shows up. And so I think that's going to largely dictate what we see out of these communities.
Yeah, and I'd imagine that would be particularly prevalent in a pivot county, is this idea of the voters are truly trying to figure out which candidate appeals to them, regardless of party, clearly. So I'm curious then, when you were talking to the voters and to the politicians, what is appealing about a particular politician or another that does get them to not have such a strong party allegiance, but more of a, I'm just going to vote for this person because that's who I like? What traits does a politician have that make them appealing to a pivot county voter?
Well, it's interesting. I think aside from just all the, the regular things we always talk about, hey, what makes for an appealing politician, right? Hey, could I have a beer with him or her? Is there a degree of being telegenic or personable? And that's all true. But really, you go community to community, Sarah, and it's the issues that matter a lot more deeply. I would argue that some of the most climate conscious Republicans in this country are in the state of Florida. You have to be. You're not going to win office as a Republican in Florida if you're not out there as aggressive about climate change as most Democrats are nationally, but that's what voters look for. So even your most conservative pro-Trump Republicans in deep Monroe County, up and down the Florida Keys, need to be the very first people to to raise the alarms about the impacts of climate change and the receding shorelines. That's not usually a GOP talking point at the national level, but there it is, and there it needs to be. Similar for the agricultural community in parts of rural Iowa. You need to really, as a politician, have a severe and really well-versed understanding of supply chain disruption and what the NAFTA era from the mid-1990s to now has done to negatively hurt the ag community. And whether you're a Democrat or Republican, if you could show up and have these conversations with farmers, with their families, with their employees, about how they've been hurt the last 20 to 30 years because of unfair trade deals, well, you're going to be a lot more inclined to get their vote regardless of whether or not you have an R or a D next to your name. So what we've seen are really the trends that matter most to each of those communities, and those are the things that we've tried to spotlight on our show as we've been lucky enough to actually visit there. And it is really a privilege to visit small town America.
That's great. That's really interesting to hear. Now, are these voters all continuously engaged? Are they paying attention as the cycle goes along and not just tuning in right before a primary? What would you say kind of maybe the news habits or the civic engagement, kind of the just in the civic space? Are these people generally engaged, or do they kind of tune in at the very end? How would you describe them? Or is there any kind of holistic pattern for the group as a whole?
I'd argue there is a bit of a pattern, and I've been interested to see that so many of these voters, Sarah, seem to be just as involved with the cable news headlines and the ups and downs of the 24-hour news cycle as we are in Washington, D.C., right? It's one thing for me. I'm a Capitol Hill reporter, right? I cover the White House for a living. When I go out pre-pandemic, of course, if I go out to happy hour with other reporters or I go to a party or something, it's an industry party where we're all talking about politics because we love it. And we talk about things like presidential history for fun. And I've been really impressed to go to these places and talk with voters, and they are just as engaged on the latest Trump tweet and the latest thing that he said at a press conference and the latest legislative effort from congressional Democrats and Nancy Pelosi. We were there visiting a lot of these places during the impeachment push, which I know feels like it's about 30 years ago.
Yeah.
They were really intimately involved and really knew, what was in the Robert Mueller report and what are the 10 or so instances of alleged obstruction of justice. And there's a lot of voters, even in small town America. And I think their political media diet demonstrates that they really know their stuff as much as any kind of post-congressional hearing happy hour would be that I go to here in Washington, which I think is pretty inspiring to see that there's so many Americans who are still tuned in, not just to their local politics, but they're very receptive to what's happening at the national level.
What is the general opinion of Congress in these counties? You mentioned Pelosi, so I'm really curious.
Yeah, I mean, everywhere I go, people just say Congress moves way too slowly. They don't really know how to get things done. There's always frustration with Congress. And you look at every cycle, and right now I'm tracking a bunch of candidates that are running for office all over the country. And whether they're Democrats or Republicans, they always have an argument to say, Congress doesn't work on behalf of the people. It moves too slowly. Honestly, I don't know that a lot of people really know that that's sort of the way Congress is supposed to be built, right? Congress is a very slow, deliberative body that's built to prevent tyranny of the majority. And in doing so, our framers set up a bit of a brilliant system where it's supposed to be tough for Congress to get things done. That's kind of the point. It is very slow, it is very bureaucratic, but it does it to protect the civil liberties of the people who aren't in power. And I think how that manifests itself is a very quick headline to say, oh, well, they're not working for you. They're taking, they're taking their time. They're dragging their feet. That frustration is very much felt in a lot of these communities that we've visited.
Were there any politicians just separate from presidential candidates or, the big names that we talk about every day? Were there any politicians that consistently were brought up? You mentioned Justin Amash earlier on the call. Were there anybody in Washington that people are talking about that aren't, top tier presidential candidate level?
That aren't, I remember, excuse me, in the fall, someone like Congressman Will Hurd would get talked a lot about. That's a good example of someone who was in a bit of a unique position, maybe one of these moderate, but a bit of a U.S.-Mexico kind of border congressman, someone who was willing to distance himself from Trump with a lot of interest about what he might do next within the GOP. I know now he's leaving Congress, but you do hear a bit of engagement of people like that. Look, of course, the Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez of the world are always going to be talked about for good and for bad on either side of debate, right? Whether you're an adversary or you're an ally. But someone like Will Hurd jumped out to me. I was almost surprised how common I would hear his name be brought up by voters. But otherwise, a lot of pivot voters, though, they know their local elected officials for sure. They know the names. They can tell you the voting records on key pieces, what someone did in opposition to a bill or in support of a bill. So people definitely know what's going on.
That's really encouraging to hear as somebody who is a fan of making sure you know who your politicians are. That is great that it is starting local, especially in these really important counties, that they are plugged in. I think that's a really encouraging thing. I'm wondering, are there any instances where, you know, we also hear, in addition to, of course, just the politics as a whole and kind of the negative communication that's happening in the space, are neighbors angry at each other for not supporting, you know, either Trump or going blue this election? Is there any kind of like hatred among neighbors, or are you seeing more of a kind of community feel in these places?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It's not one that I've come across too much. There's just one story that jumps out to me from a Somali American immigrant family in Eagle Lake, Minnesota, which is outside Mankato. You know, people would be surprised to know that the greatest collection, the greatest concentration of Somali Americans in this country live in Minnesota, right? Mm-hmm. You think of someone like Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. There's a lot of Somali Americans. They're either refugees or they're immigrants, and they have very proudly come to this family. And due to the sort of last couple of decades of work that's been available and how a lot of those communities kind of view themselves, frigid cold Minnesota has been where they've wound up. And I remember Abdi Sabri is the name of the father who's on the school board. He's raising his family himself, a Somali immigrant who came to this country in the late 1980s. And I remember him saying openly he's not a Donald Trump fan. Everyone in his community knows he's not a Donald Trump fan. Yet the guy across the street when we were there very proudly has a wide variety of Make America Great Again paraphernalia dotting his lawn. And I was really pleased to hear Abby openly say, you know what? That neighbor brings me, my wife, and my daughters food and gifts and things like that. And we make our own kind of, I think we're called sambusas. Which is a sort of Somali American dish that we actually eat with them in a family dinner in the episode. And he says, we make sambusas and we bring it right over to them, right? There's a sense that like, I can respect your views and you can respect mine. You certainly wish that all communities had that sense of like neighborly good love and an open acceptance that, hey, you have your views and I have mine, but we're still a part of this community. We certainly know that that's not the case, but that's one interesting story we got to document in our Blue Earth County episode that definitely stands out to me. I remember it fondly.
That's again really encouraging to hear. I think a lot of those stories exist more than they ever get covered, especially in counties where there is, you know, I'm in Maryland, so I'm very used to being in a blue state and seeing the interactions there, but you are in these states where they are much more split. I think you still do get that sense of community, and post-COVID, it'll be very interesting, just as we have not come together as a community, what smaller counties like that do. I think it'll be just a happy time when this all happens and the 2020 election is over.
Sure.
So the final question that I wanted to ask is, do you have any people that particularly stood out to you, just as kind of who exemplify the idea of a pivot county, just either through their work history or how they interacted with you? Are there any people who you kind of think about when you think of pivot counties?
Oh, absolutely. I actually got to tell you this really interesting trend too, is that I've spoken with a lot of pivot voters. Very few of them want to be interviewed on camera. And that's just a really bit of an interesting trend. And God knows we have tried. We have only a 3-person production team that goes and handles all this. And that includes myself and then my colleagues, Megan Pratt and Douglas Murray, who do the Lord's work. And truly, these are Herculean efforts to pull together what's now 24-minute episodes for each place. And there's definitely a lot of that in these communities. But they, you know, a lot of these people though, whether it's, you know, maybe they feel a little bit of shame or, you know, they're not that comfortable talking about it. As soon as you say that you have a camera, they really clam up and they say, well, I don't, you know, I'm okay talking with you one-on-one and I'll spill my whole voting history and I'll tell you everything. But I'm not that comfortable. You know, maybe I'm a business owner. I don't want people to know.
Yeah.
We've come across that a lot. A lot of business owners or people who are a bit visible in their community. And Sarah, they still don't want people to know maybe that they voted for Donald Trump in 2016. That's been kind of the inkling that I've gotten. So, you know, we continue to talk with these people and they continue to be open. It's just a matter of trying to get their exact reaction on camera. Can be a little bit challenging, but we still continue those conversations nonetheless.
Well, and that's why the reporting on it no matter where we are, it just does become super hard, is because it's the reason why polling was so wrong in 2016, and the reason why nobody could get the pulse on these voters is because we are seeing that trend in a Trump world where people are being more private with who they're actually going in and casting their ballot for. And the climate kind of created that feedback loop. But I'm wondering if as you're going through the pivot counties, do you think you're getting a full scope of what's really happening? Are people being super protective of not wanting to say that they're pro-Biden or say that they're pro-Trump? Is there kind of that protective layer, even just taking out the camera? Are people not even talking to you about that kind of stuff, or are they open about that?
Yeah, no, they are willing to, but it does take us a while though to kind of crack that nut and really kind of get in there and develop people's confidence, right? We try and do a lot of pre-production, which basically means we're setting up our interviews ahead of time. We're doing phone calls with them. We're pre-arranging, but then there's a lot of other times, like I just did down in Monroe County, where, you know, we're looking for a specific type of voter or a community official. And I'm basically just knocking door to door and just trying to introduce myself, describe what we do, and say, hey, would you be willing to talk with us? You know, and you're kind of introducing in one conversation who you are, what you do, what the show is about, demonstrate good faith, and then try and get them to yes to join you for the episode, which is probably the toughest thing that I do, but we've had really good success with it. And once people, again, see that as a reporter, you're willing to sort of leave the beltway, go to where they are, express a really decent, good faith conversation, they will open up with you for sure. And the sense is, yeah, there's probably some protections of people saying, you know, maybe I don't want people to know that I'm necessarily a Donald Trump supporter right now, or that, yeah, I actually kind of do like Joe Biden. But the other thing I'd caution is that, you know, a lot of these trips we had were before there was a massive pandemic that changed life for everybody. And there's just no telling right now, Sarah, how this is going to be impacting things. And I think what this does to people, for instance, who always have been Donald Trump supporters, I was thinking this earlier before our call, you know, you look at, you know, someone like Piers Morgan, as silly an example as that is right now, is in the middle of this big feud with Donald. He's always been very close with Donald Trump. And like another one's Matt Drudge from the Drudge Report, who's always given very glowing coverage to Donald Trump, who right now is now firmly on the other side. There's been something fundamentally about Donald Trump's response to this that is turning off people who have feverishly been his supporters. And I think if you're seeing it with big prominent names like Drudge, you're also going to see it with a lot of voters. And we just haven't had the opportunity yet to quite get engaged, quite feel that pulse for maybe how this coronavirus response is going to have either a positive or a negative impact for his reelection bid in November.
What's next for the series then, since you can't right now hop on a plane and fly to Minnesota? Are you going to be trying to check the pulse in different counties, checking in with people who you're planning to go see? What are you going to do kind of in this world pre-November to check in with them?
Sure. Yeah, we're definitely continuing the conversation. For instance, we just, every Monday on Cheddar Business at 12 o'clock, I co-host our Cheddar Politics show. And just yesterday, I was out because, like I said, I'm still getting over being sick myself. So my colleague Megan, who you know, Sarah, she sat in, she just did a catch-up interview live on air with a guy we called Farmer Dan. People who've seen our Blue Earth County, Minnesota episode will remember Farmer Dan really well. And he was willing to fire up the Skype for us and give us a sense on how his pork farm supply chain has been disrupted so in such a tough way. So We're finding ways because Cheddar still broadcasts live, right? We broadcast every day from 7 a.m. weekdays to 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So we still have the opportunity to get these stories told from people who are now willing to kind of teleconference us, who we've featured on the show before. Look, we're hoping to get out there. Pardon me. We're hoping to get out there and be back on the trail. We got places in the Pacific Northwest, a few communities in Washington State we want to hit. Jefferson County, Tyler, I think, is the one down in the state of Texas. We really, in Texas that we want to hit. And we had a few others. It remains to be seen how many we'll be able to get to before November, but we're committed to keeping up with the storytelling as much as we can.
That's great to hear. I'll be really looking forward to tuning in. Where can people find you on the internet?
Yeah, of course. Up on cheddar.com, there's a specific landing page that's up there now, specifically for our first 3 episodes of the Pivot Counties, which are up again. That's Jasper County, Iowa, Valencia County, New Mexico, Blue Earth County, Minnesota, and our 4th episode, Monroe County, which is the Florida Keys. That's going to be up in the next couple of weeks, and we're going to continue the conversation as best we can here, Sarah, while we're all still, at home quarantined in our sweatpants.
Great. Yep. Today was the first day I put makeup on in a week, so we're looking forward to any webinars that you guys do and broadcast. So
of course,
great.
It's so great to meet your cat. I hope your cat's a big fan of the Pivot Cat.
He's very excited to see a different face. But well, thank you so much for joining us. Yeah. Again, go to cheddar.com for that coverage. At Ballotpedia, we are closely following the 206 Pivot counties. We looked at what happened to them in 2018. And please check out ballotpedia.org for that coverage. And we're also tracking, we mentioned election reform policy changes and everything like that. We are tracking that closely. If you're confused about when you're going to vote in your state, please check us. We're going to be tracking that for you to make sure everybody's aware of when and how they need to vote this cycle. And if you have any suggestions for future Ballotpedia Insights guests, please feel free to email me at sarah.rozier@ballotpedia.org. But otherwise, we'll see you later. Thanks, guys. Stay safe and be well, JD.
Thank you, Sarah. Appreciate it. Talk to you.
Thanks, guys. Bye.